We find ourselves today slow walking toward an utterly predictable and entirely preventable constitutional crisis, with an imperial executive branch continuing to amass power in itself, and with a legislature all too happy to oblige and that seems unable or unwilling to exercise any meaningful oversight, and with a judiciary that seems to prefer legislating to judging, we find ourselves standing on the banks of the Rubicon. My name is Will Galloway. I'm a student at Clemson University, and from April 2019 to July of 2020, I served as the chair of the South Carolina Federation of College Republicans. I'm going to be speaking with you today about the erosion of our separation of power systems, its consequences for our republic, and how we can work together to rebuild a robust system of checks and balances that will preserve our liberties and protect our political order. Our founding fathers realized that no matter how exhaustive a Bill of Rights, no matter how comprehensive the listing might be, no matter how judicious the American people were in the preservation of their rights and their freedoms, the best protection against tyranny, the best guard of our democracy would come from the very structure of the government itself. James Madison said it well in Federalist 51 when he wrote, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place." And he also said, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the government, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. The great Roman statesman and philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero said that without the proper guardrails, democracy would easily turn into tyranny. Our founding fathers realized this too. So they established a brilliant political system where each branch of government would have unique responsibilities, and they would have an interest in preventing other branches from accumulating too much power, and it would be able to do so. They did this through a robust system of judicial review, vetoes, legislative overrides, staggered elections, and all sorts of brilliant innovations. They all prevented one branch from establishing a tyranny over the other branches and from establishing a tyranny over the American people. This system has always been a bulwark protecting our rights and liberties and preserving American representative democracy against tyranny. Somehow, though, it all seemed to change. We've either forgotten about or given up on the system of checks and balances and separation of powers, and our Congress hands more and more lawmaking power to the executive with each passing year. In the decade before 2016, executive agencies passed 27 rules for every one law the Congress passed. That doesn't even begin to count executive orders and presidential directives. On issues as big and as consequential as immigration to as small as showerhead definitions, these aren't just clarifications, they're not just directives, they're fiat laws. They don't come from the duly elected legislature. They don't come from Congress. They come from an unelected and unaccountable bureaucracy and from political appointees whose loyalties are bound to one person and one person only, the president. We all know this on some level or another. Ask yourself this: what is the most important election to you on the ballot this November? If you're like me, you said one thing. You didn't think of your state representative. You didn't think of your governor, your congressman, your senator, anything else, not your school board or whatever. You thought of the contest between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And in some ways, you're probably right. Why? Because in America in 2020, our president not only enforces the law, he and his appointees and the bureaucracy underneath him are often the creators of the law. Our idea of government has become part and parcel to the office of the presidency. And when you have a president like Donald Trump, a president with little to no respect for our political institutions, things like the separation of powers, and a president with such a cult of personality that he has convinced one party and one half of Congress that their job is to do their bidding or they will lose re-election. When you have a president like that, the center of gravity only becomes closer and closer to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and farther from the people. That's not democracy. It's ruled by decree. It's not a republic. It's dangerously close to tyranny. Both campaigns, both Trump's campaign and Joe Biden's campaign, are increasingly describing this election as a great battle for the soul of America, for our way of life, for our system of government. And in some ways, they might even be right. But have we stopped to think about why? What is it in our democracy, in our republic, that one man can have so much control over our country, so much control over our lives, so much control over our political systems? And have we stopped to think how we, as a free people, can allow that to happen? I think the answer is simple. It's sad, but it's simple. The answer is an utter abdication of responsibility at all levels of our federal government. You could hardly write profiles in courage about our contemporary politicians, but it would be all too easy to write something called profiles in self-preservation. Our political leaders have become so concerned with not rocking the boat and not endangering their own chances for re-election that they're not even willing to perform the most basic core functions of their job. Show me a bill from the last few years that doesn't in some way hand power to the executive branch of the government, and I will show you a unicorn. Why? Because Congress has developed this neat little system where when things go well, they can take all the credit for it. But when things go poorly, they can blame the executive. They can say, no, that's not our fault. Don't blame us at the ballot box this November. It's passing the buck. They've created a horrible system where there's no responsibility and the people cannot hold them accountable. Now, the consequences of this erosion aren't immediately obvious all the time, but I would suggest that they can be cataclysmic. With all this blame shifting, it's more difficult than ever to hold our government accountable at the ballot box. And with ever-changing and poorly communicated bureaucratic codes, it's easier than ever to break federal law. Most of these laws are funny. Check out a crime a day on Twitter to learn how a dying bird in a compost bin can put you in federal prison. Check out a crime a day on Twitter. It's a great account. You'll see what I mean. But some of these ever-changing codes have real consequences for real people. Justice Neil Gorsuch, in his wonderful book, A Republic If You Can Keep It, tells the story of a man named Alfonso Deniz Robles, who followed the law as closely as he could be reasonably expected to, while attempting to become a United States citizen, going through the whole process, legally, responsibly. But the law changed through an unaccountable bureaucratic process. The law changed, and he had to start all over again. I'd strongly recommend that book to anyone trying to get a sense of the civil and criminal consequences of the breakdown in our separation of powers system. So, apart from these more personal consequences, the ramifications for the degradation of our checks and balances system for our country as a whole represents an utter and complete abandonment of the Republican liberty that we so prize for bureaucratic expediency, a rejection of the rule of law by our leaders for their own political survival. The powers of government, all the powers of government have become overwhelmingly consolidated in one person, the president, the executive branch. With the right leader, with a Lincoln or a George Washington or someone of that caliber, this isn't a problem, and in some ways that might even be a good thing. But as the Federalist Papers remind us, we cannot always count on having an enlightened statesman at the helm, and men are not always angels. That's certainly the case in 2020. So where do we go from here? What's the next step? We're on the banks of the Rubicon. Where do we go? How do we restore a system, the integrity of our separation of powers system? I have a few suggestions. First, vote. It's the simplest and most easy thing to do, but we have to vote for people with integrity who have the political courage necessary to do their job well within the confines of our political system and to protect our liberties, to be judicious of their power, and to go to Washington and do their job. Take the elections of your congressmen and your senators and your legislators seriously. Elect people who will guard their authority against an encroaching executive and fight for you, not just for their re-election chances, not just for their political survival. And the next thing I would say is this: defend your institutions, defend our institutions. The most important safeguard of our separation of powers is those institutions. our democratic institutions, our political institutions, our media institutions, our social institutions. Read about them, learn their purpose, and learn how we can defend them. And when you hear people criticizing them unfairly, defend them. Remind them why those institutions matter, how they can be a safeguard of their liberty. If we're really going to protect American democracy, we can only do so much at the ballot box. We have to do so in the hearts and minds of the people themselves. John Adams wrote in a letter in 1818, what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? No, he said. The revolution was effected in the hearts and minds of the American people before the war commenced. The revolution was in the hearts of the people. Real change always begins at the lowest level and flows up. And in this case, that means protecting our institutions and protecting our liberties. That's why I'm so excited to participate in the Convention on Founding Principles, because I know that these kinds of conversations about defending our liberties, defending our institutions, and defending our founding principles will be the ultimate safeguard of our republic and the separation of powers system. I challenge you not to leave that here. Continue these conversations. Continue these defenses. Continue all of these important things and take them with you. Defend them with your friends. Defend them with your families. And God bless.